Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're looking at one of the most instantly recognizable figures in human history. We all know the civil rights icon, right? We know the epic speeches, the marches, that profound legacy. But, very few of us actually know the fascinating, complex, and honestly, deeply human story of the young boy who eventually became that icon. Like, how does a kid just navigating a rigidly segregated world actually transform into a leader who would change it forever?
How did a boy named Michael become the icon known as Martin? It's a pretty remarkable question, isn't it? Long before the monuments were built and the history books were written, there was literally just a kid growing up in the American South. Today, we're going to uncover the exact moments of trauma, of defiance, and realization that totally forged his identity. 1955 brought the Montgomery bus boycott. Then 1963 was the March on Washington, followed by the Nobel Peace Prize in '64, and tragically, his assassination in 1968. Okay, let's dive into this because, these are his massive, monumental adult achievements. But by establishing this timeline right off the bat, we can actually just set it aside. For the rest of this explainer, we're completely freeing ourselves up to focus entirely on his youth. The crucible that made all these later dates even possible.
Part 1, A Boy Named Michael. Let's travel way back in time to January 15th, 1929, right to a two-story home in Atlanta, Georgia.
Born Michael King Jr. in Atlanta, Georgia, to a family of sharecroppers and ministers. He was the second of three kids, and his family tree, it was deeply rooted in the church and the soil. His paternal grandparents were actually sharecroppers, while his maternal grandfather, Adam Daniel Williams, he was a rural minister who moved to Atlanta and eventually became the pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church. So young Michael grew up in this busy, multi-generational home right on the second floor of his grandparents' house. He was totally immersed in a world where his father, Michael Sr., eventually took over that very same pulpit and ended up raising church attendance into the thousands. Now, in 1934, something really pivotal happened. Not to the boy, but to his father. The church actually sent Michael Sr. on this huge multinational trip, which included a stop in Berlin for the 5th Congress of the Baptist World Alliance. Keep in mind, this was 1934. Nazism was on the rise in Germany. And right in the middle of all that, the Congress adopted this powerful resolution condemning all racial animosity, oppression, and unfair discrimination, calling it a direct violation of the law of God. And while he was over there in Germany, his father also took time to visit historical sites associated with the great Reformation leader, Martin Luther.
Michael King Jr. versus Martin Luther King Jr. And this brilliantly illustrates what happened next. Upon returning home in August of 1934, totally inspired by what he had just seen and heard, Michael Sr. changed his own name to Martin Luther King. But he didn't stop there. He also changed his 5-year-old son's name from Michael King Jr. to Martin Luther King Jr. That single decision forever altered the young boy's destiny, permanently connecting him to a massive legacy of religious reform.
Part 2, First Encounters with Racism. Because, a new name couldn't exactly shield him from the harsh realities of the world he was growing up in. So let's look at those early childhood moments that really began to forge his understanding of systemic injustice. In September 1935, everything kind of shifted. Young Martin actually had a white playmate. The boy's father owned a business right across the street from the King home, and the two kids played together all the time. But that lasted right up until September 1935, when they both turned 6 and it was time to start elementary school. Suddenly, a hard line was drawn. Martin was sent to Yonge Street Elementary School for black children, while his friend was sent over to a totally separate school exclusively for white children. We are white and you are colored. Shortly after they started at their separate segregated schools, the white boy's parents told Martin flat out that he was no longer allowed to play with their son. And their justification was just stark and cruel. They said, "We are white and you are colored." Think about being a 6-year-old hearing that. This was Martin's very first direct, painful confrontation with the bitter reality of Jim Crow racism. When a heartbroken Martin relayed this whole thing to his parents, they sat him down and explained the grim, heavy history of slavery and racism in America. The young boy was understandably furious. He'd later say this conversation made him determined to hate every white person. But his parents immediately countered that youthful anger. They firmly instructed him that despite the injustice, despite everything, it was still his Christian duty to love everyone.
We'll either buy shoes sitting here or we won't buy any shoes at all. You see, loving everyone definitely didn't mean accepting mistreatment. Martin watched his father constantly stand up against segregation. In one incredibly empowering moment, his dad took him into a downtown Atlanta shoe store. The clerk immediately demanded they move to the back of the store to be served. Well, Martin Sr. flatly refused. He said, we'll either buy shoes sitting here or we won't buy any shoes at all. And then he just walked right out of the store with his son. He was teaching Martin Jr. a vital lesson in defiance, telling him afterward that he would absolutely never accept this system, no matter how long he had to live with it.
Section 3. Faith, Tragedy, and Youth. As Martin transitioned from childhood into adolescence, things actually got even more complex. His really strict religious upbringing started clashing head-on with profound personal tragedy and some serious intellectual doubt.
May 18, 1941. The traumatic loss of his grandmother, Mama. On this day, a deeply traumatic event just completely shook 12-year-old Martin. See, he had sneaked away from his studies at home to go watch a parade. But while he was gone, his beloved grandmother, Jenny, whom he affectionately called Mama, and who told him all these lively Bible stories after dinner, suffered a fatal heart attack. When Martin returned and found out, his guilt was just absolute. Believing his deception about the parade somehow caused God to take her, the distraught boy actually attempted suicide by jumping out of a second-story window. It's a miracle, but thankfully he survived the fall.
His father desperately tried to comfort him, explaining that he shouldn't blame himself, that this was simply part of God's plan. But young Martin struggled deeply with that explanation. By the time he was 13, his grief had really compounded into this intense intellectual skepticism. Doubts were springing forth unrelentingly. He found he just couldn't identify with the big emotional displays of his church's congregants. He even stood up in Sunday school and straight up denied the literal bodily resurrection of Jesus.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how completely human it makes him, right? Because amidst all that heavy grief and deep religious questioning, he was still just a vibrant teenager. His friends nicknamed him Tweed, or Tweety, because the guy loved fashion. He was often out there sporting polished patent leather shoes and sharp tweed suits. He loved flirting, he loved dancing the jitterbug, and while he did occasionally get into physical altercations in his neighborhood, he usually avoided fights by simply talking his way out of them. How? By using a massive vocabulary he built just by reading dictionaries.
Part 4. Finding his voice. That massive dictionary vocabulary, combined with his naturally resonant baritone voice, was soon going to need a much larger platform. And that brings us right to his high school years at Booker T. Washington High, which was the only high school in the entire city for African-American students. Let's move along and see how this builds, because Martin was seriously intellectually gifted. I mean, he completely skipped the 9th grade. He chose English and sociology as his main subjects, though, surprisingly enough, he actually lacked an interest in spelling and grammar. He ended up relying on his older sister Christine to help him spell. But where he truly shined? Public speaking. That booming baritone and his dictionary-fueled vocabulary made him an absolute natural, and he quickly became a commanding presence on the school debate team. So, what exactly sparked his lifelong fight? We've seen the pieces falling into place, right? The awareness of racism, the defiance he learned from his father, those formidable speaking skills. But what was the real catalyst? What specific event took all of this raw potential and sparked a lifelong, unyielding fight for civil rights? The true climax of his adolescent origin story happens in his junior year, April 13th, 1944. At just 15 years old, Martin delivered his very first public speech during an oratorical contest. He took the stage and delivered this remarkably powerful message about the plight and reality of Black America. Black America still wears chains. The finest Negro is at the mercy of the meanest white man. Just listen to the intense weight of those words, spoken by a 15-year-old. It's a chilling, completely prophetic quote that heavily foreshadows the immense civil rights leader he was destined to become. And honestly, unsurprisingly, Martin won the contest. But the high of that amazing victory was just instantly crushed by the degrading reality of the Jim Crow South. On the infuriating 90-mile bus ride back home to Atlanta, the bus started filling up with white passengers. The driver literally ordered Martin and his teacher to give up their seats. When Martin hesitated, the driver cursed at him, calling him a deeply offensive racial slur. His teacher advised him that they'd literally be breaking the law if they didn't comply. So this young boy, who had literally just won an oratorical contest about the dignity of Black Americans, was forced to stand in the aisle for the entire 90-mile journey home. Reflecting on this incredibly degrading journey, he later wrote, "That night will never leave my memory. It was the angriest I have ever been in my life. This was it, the absolute crucible moment. It was the moment that truly crystallized his lifelong mission against injustice. The anger was complete, for sure, but how he chose to use it would literally change history."
So the crucial point is what he actually did next. Because of World War II, college enrollments were way down. And Morehouse College, which was the same historically black college his father and grandfather had attended, opened its entrance exams to high school juniors. Martin channeled all of that intense anger from that bus ride directly into his academics. He passes the entrance exam at 15, and he enters Morehouse in the autumn of 1944. The boy's youth was officially over, and the historical journey of the man had truly begun. Knowing the trauma and anger that forged his youth, how much more powerful is his ultimate legacy of nonviolent love? When we look back at the icon today, we see the champion of peaceful resistance. But knowing the deep trauma, the profound guilt, the agonizing doubts, and the searing, entirely justified anger that forged his youth, doesn't his legacy of nonviolent love feel that much more powerful? It wasn't born of naivety, not at all. It was a deliberate, incredibly hard-fought choice, made by a boy who saw the absolute worst of the world and just decided to change it anyway. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.